Today I'm having tea with the holder of the Law Faculty Trust Chair in Social Justice at the University of Stellenbosch, more popularly known as Prof. Thuli Madonsela. Prof. Madonsela has become a household name in South Africa just a few years after being appointed by President Jacob Zuma in 2009 as our public protector, after all parties in Parliament unanimously supported her nomination. During those 7 turbulent years, she faced vilification and praise in just about equal measure, if you have to count up all the articles and comments, and in the process established the Public Protector's Office indelibly in the constitutional architecture of South Africa, and built an extraordinarily important body of jurisprudence through the courts in review processes and enforcement processes of her findings. So an enormously important person, recognized throughout the world, many honorary doctorates, but it's a person whom we know actually surprisingly little about. And so the very first question I want to ask Prof. Thuli Madonsela, after welcoming her to tea, is, won't you tell us something about yourself? You're a very private person. We'd like to know a little bit more about you.
Yeah. Well, hi, Helen, and thank you for the privilege to have another cup of tea with you. I suppose the public already knows that I'm a mother of 2 children who are Mbuso Wabantu Madonsela, which means democracy, by the way.
Oh, great.
And his second name is Fidel, named after Fidel Castro. And my daughter is Wenzile Una Madonsela, and Wenzile means you did a great thing, God, and Una means precious. I'm also a sister. I'm a lawyer. People know also that I'm engaged. And
yes, I saw that engagement ring on your finger. More people like romance.
Well, I got engaged in December 2017.
Wow, that's a long engagement.
It is a long engagement.
Are you making sure?
Yeah, well, no, I'm absolutely certain. But I started a new job at the beginning of last year, and I've just been trying to adjust. And I'll talk a little bit later also about the Musa Plan project, which takes a whole lot of my time together with the teaching and Tuma Foundation. But just back to I'm a lawyer. I've been a social justice activist for as long as I can remember. Injustice is one thing that drives me. Wanting to see justice, wanting to see happiness is something that drives me from the point when I was small. And I do remember my early days as a young lawyer. I found myself in a situation where I was confronted with young people who were on the death penalty from Beckersdale for a crime they had never committed, and the judge had convicted them on an extreme interpretation of the common purpose rule.
I remember that case on common purpose, yes.
Yes, and when the sisters told me the story, I was at that stage a student and a part-time trade unionist. I immediately thought this was improper, and I approached Priscilla Jana about this case, and eventually we approached Ismail Mohammed, and the matter was taken on appeal. And yeah, those young...
And the death penalty was reversed at that time on them.
It was reversed. The sad thing is you die many deaths on death row, and life can never be the same. I know for a fact that some of those young people have passed on because Yeah.
I remember that case very, very well because I was in the Black Sash at the time.
Yes.
And we also took up the issue of common purpose.
Yes.
And I remember at the time, I think it was for killing a counsellor after labeling him as a sellout at the time.
Yes.
And the crime was very, very gruesome, but the notion that everybody in the crowd had common purpose to kill that councillor was the one that was contested. But before we go into the details of that particular issue, let me just go over some of the grounds that I thought were fascinating when I read your story. You were born in Greater Johannesburg, in what is now Soweto, and you were raised by two very loving and committed parents and educated in Swaziland. I thought that was very interesting. And obviously went to university in Swaziland. Did you get an A-level matric there, or did you get a South African matric?
I got an O-level in Swaziland, and that's why Wits was my first choice in terms of studying for my first degree, and Wits needed an A-level, and therefore I went back to Swaziland to do my first degree. But I couldn't do law immediately. I initially did in humanities. It's a long story about my mom, who was the driver behind my education. My mom was a former domestic worker who had become an informal trader. My father, a former farm worker, eventually a factory laborer who had become an informal trader. My father thought we needed just half an education. My mom thought we needed a full education. But she still thought that lawyers are crooks, really people who get people, allow people to get away with murder. Well, they allow people to get away with murder, literally. Yeah. That's a common view, sadly, in the townships and villages.
Not the idea that everyone deserves a defense.
Well, yeah. It's a question of not fully understanding how the law operates, but more important, it's also understanding that the law is perverted in application. Because if I've seen you kill someone and wrongly killing that person, and we go to court and a court of law says there's not enough evidence, I know I saw it. So, but those are things that show that there's something wrong sometimes with how we apply the law, because these rules were created for small villages and we now apply them in a modern, complex world where people forget things because there's too much information, and we still apply the rules that were meant for little villages where people remember what happened yesterday and the case is tried the following day. But anyway, what I wanted to show was my parents then didn't want me to my mom, even though she wanted me to be educated, she didn't want me to be a lawyer because the church was against it. My pastor came to beg her to convince me not to take law because good Christians shouldn't study law. Therefore, I did humanities, but for a year and didn't like it. Came back home, taught a little bit, and did other things. I taught a bit at Naledi High. You taught at your old
school, the high school that you were at?
Well, I taught at Evelyn Baring immediately after finishing high school. That was while I was waiting to go to university. Yes, for the first, it's for about the first 8 months, because the universities in Swaziland, like in England, the term only starts in September.
So you had a long time to teach. Now let me move on really quickly and talk a little bit about how you became the public protector. I remember our very first conversation in 2009 in my office in Cape Town, and by then I knew that you'd been a member of the ANC and you were going to be sent to Parliament as a member of the ANC, and I was very worried, and I remember raising it with you that you might become the ANC protector, and you said to me, absolutely not. I'm not going to be anybody's protector. I'm going to be the protector of the rule of law and the Constitution. I remember that conversation very well. So how did you feel when you were nominated and appointed as the public protector? Because I think that appointment must have had, shall we say, unintended consequences for Jacob Zuma.
Well, it certainly did. But I don't know what his intentions were. I must firstly clarify that I was not an ANC nominee. The ANC had its own nominee. I was a nominee of the South African Women in Dialogue, who have members of the ANC, and the founder obviously is a member of the ANC, Zanele Mbeki. but she was not in good books of the ANC at the time. South African Women in Dialogue, Sawit, nominated me. However, the ANC fully supported my nomination in Parliament, hence I got 100% vote or unanimous vote, and President Zuma really supported me. How did I feel about it? The woman who nominated me, Martha Mole, reminded me that I had always been a public protector, and that this was an opportunity to protect the public with authority. And I truly do believe that before we put people in positions such as judging or public protector, you have to look at the track record. Has this person been doing exactly that? So I had been protecting the public. We had just established the South African Women Lawyers Association. We started what today is Wills Week. We used to call it Access to Justice Week, and we provided education to people about all manners of the law, everyday law, so to speak, and also provided them with wills. But even before then, I spoke about the Becker style case. By the way, those boys were not at the event. So
they weren't at the event.
It was an extreme application of the common purpose principle, where if you are a member of an organization or you associate yourself with a particular group, whatever that group does, whenever they do it.
I remembered it differently. I remember that they being in the crowd there, but you said they were only members of an organization.
Yeah, no, these ones, the ones that we rescued from death penalty, had not been there. That's why we say it was an extreme application of the death penalty.
Well, that seems an
extreme application.
If people weren't even there and get sentenced to death because someone in the organization did it. Yeah. That's extreme in the extreme.
It is, and it was an extreme application. Nobody could put them at the place. They had alibis. It was, but anyway, let's go back to feeling about the public protector. At that stage, I never anticipated that the public protector was going to deal with corruption, because you'll recall that the Scorpions had occupied that space. But just as I was being appointed as a public protector, the Scorpions were being disbanded, which opened a space around having an agency that focuses on corruption. And so it was a historical accident that although the public protector had powers to handle all manner of wrongdoing in government, it was not the history of the public protector to focus on corruption because somebody else was handling it. And I often think that Selby Barqua in particular is criticized wrongly, because at the time when he was the public protector, the space of the public protector was to protect the Gogo Dlaminis, to focus on maladministration, the injustice that constitutes what you would call the kinds of problems that are envisaged in Paja, maladministration or administrative injustices. And so it was accidental that in the absence of the Scorpions, a lot of those cases that would have gone to the Scorpions ended up coming to the public protector office. And also the problem of unethical conduct seemed to increase during my time, which again, by default, made us go into that space.
Well, it's very interesting how history is an unexpected confluence of different circumstances and unintended consequences. Very fascinating. And of course, the rest is really history. I remember the one occasion that you investigated me very, very clearly. And that was interesting indeed. It was a tough period, but it was absolutely appropriate, and you're right to do that.
Well, they say you bullied me into... You know the trolls, you know. I have permanent trolls on my timeline.
Welcome to the club.
And they say you bullied me into withdrawing my provisional findings, but I suppose people also don't understand. Fortunately, all my decisions have always been, open and clear. That the argument that was being made was that there's a difference between unlawful and improper. And if it's unlawful, it violates a law. Correct. But if it violates a guideline, it might be too strong to say it's unlawful. Correct. Because a guideline is a guide, and it does not have the same status as a law. But try to tell it to some of those who don't want the truth. It's okay.
Well, I'm completely used to Twitter, and the very important point about this long-form podcast that I'm trying to pioneer is to get away from the sewer of Twitter, to rather get into the long-form conversation where you can really dig deeper. And of course, it's quite extraordinary the power people think I have, because they think anything that happens anywhere must be because Zille bullied someone. And it's quite true. Bizarre. And then to think that you could be bullied by anyone is also a bizarre notion. But anyway, that's the Twitterverse. It gets the dog by the tail every single time and then wonders why it gets bitten. So we can move on from there. It is true that during your term as public protector, you really got a lot of major principles in the Constitution tested and a whole lot of jurisprudence established all the way to the Constitutional Court. And I think your most famous report was the one you titled, and you always had these colourful names for your reports, Secure in Comfort. That was the one about Nkandla. And in that, you made certain recommendations and Parliament brushed them aside, or the majority party in Parliament brushed them aside, not the opposition parties. And President Zuma at the time blithely ignored it. And then, interestingly enough, the DA and the EFF approached the Constitutional Court for a ruling as to whether the findings of the Public Protector are indeed binding. And in that extraordinary judgment, the Constitutional Court even rapped Parliament over the knuckles for not doing its job of oversight of the executive. Now, how does it feel to be in a historical position where you're giving content to the words in the Constitution through actual cases that are adjudicated in the Constitutional Court? And how do you feel about that one and other ones?
It's been a humbling experience, because from our side we sought not to make history. We sought to defend the truth as we understood it. It was partly about the contents of the matter, which was R250 billion could not be used for the renovation of one person's house or one employee of the state, whether they were a president or cleaner. It was obscene to do that. But the second thing, of course, was the issue of our powers, because instead of engaging us on the ethics of spending so much money on one person's welfare, we were then engaged on the powers of the Public Protector. And we thought that was important, that clarity be there. Often people think the Public Protector had no binding powers until the Constitutional Court gave that institution those powers. It's a wrong interpretation. The powers of the Public Protector were given by the Constitutional Assembly when it drafted that constitution and said the Public Protector has the power to investigate, report, and take appropriate remedial action. That was a departure from the 1993 Constitution that had the power to investigate and report. And of course, the third power was introduced deliberately, and it had to have some implications. The good thing is that until then, most findings that were made by myself as Public Protector with the help of my team, we accepted by all, including the President.
Absolutely. A review application was very rare on your findings.
It started, I think the problem started with against the rules. Nkandla was just somewhere downstream.
But Nkandla wasn't a challenge. It wasn't a challenge to your finding. It was a challenge to the government to take appropriate action on your finding. And of course, the Constitutional Court couldn't give you an additional power. They could only interpret the powers that the Constitution gave you, and they interpreted in such a way as to say these powers are meaningful, and if people don't want to implement, they can only avoid doing so if they take the report on review to the High Court.
Absolutely. I would say Chief Justice Mogoeng with concurrence of his colleagues, gave a very seminal judgment. And I think there are three takeaways from what you're saying from that. The one was clarifying the powers of the Public Protector to be binding when the Public Protector means to bind. Because they won't always bind. If the power protector clearly makes a recommendation, it would remain a recommendation. And in my reports, when I was still power protector, there were sections of the report where it would be a clear directive, you must do this. And then there would be a part of the report, I would say, consider doing this. When I say consider doing this, I would be respecting the powers of the executive and understanding that this one is not a must in terms of separation of powers. It's not a must, but I think you should do it. It could make your life easier and it could strengthen democracy if you did that. So the second thing that the court did was ethics, was the level of ethical conduct that is expected from the President and Parliament. And the third thing was what you've highlighted is Parliament had slept on duty, and I think the Chief Justice basically spoke to Parliament like a headmaster speaks to students and say, you must do this. And it's encouraging to see that Parliament took that lesson and things are working fairly better since
Absolutely, but that's how history really goes on a fast forward. Because in many democracies, it takes at least a century for Parliament to get into the groove of being able to hold the executive to account.
Certainly.
Here, we really concertinaed history, took a whole leapfrog over it, and now Parliament has to come into its own because of a judgment. And I think you must be the only person in South Africa, if I can think of anybody else, who's actually united NUMSA and AfriForum in support of the work that you were doing. So that was really good. Now, you must have had 1,000 offers when you stepped down as public protector after your non-renewable single term, as in the Constitution. Why did you choose Stellenbosch and the chair in social justice here?
Well, I chose Stellenbosch for two reasons. One was I had always been a social justice activist. What drove me to law was social justice. And I remember applying for a scholarship and saying I want to become a lawyer so that I can use the law to advance justice. And at that stage, my sense of it was really to end discrimination, including structural discrimination. But the second reason Stellenbosch was appealing to me was the Bell Pottinger campaign that was introduced just when I started the investigation on state capture. And it became clear to me that campaign caught wildfire, it caught off like a wildfire because there was fertile ground for it. There were so many people who were left behind. I mean, the stats on poverty in this country, we've just seen the stats. We've just seen the stats recently. 55% of the people in this country are poor, but there's disparities in that poverty. In that there's 1% white people who are poor, 64.2% black poverty. Provincially, Eastern Cape, more than 72% of the population poor. Gauteng, about 35%. But it's all toxic. And it was clear to me that there is collateral value in adversity. The Bell Pottinger campaign divided us for the purposes of ruling us. With the white monopoly capital, their wealth explains your poverty approach, but it also woke us to the reality of the need to do something about poverty and inequality. And when Stellenbosch made this offer, I was so happy because I wasn't going to have an administrative job or a management job. I was going to have a ground job.
Great.
Yes.
Now let me just go back, because you've raised a lot of very important issues. Let's first go back to this issue of poverty.
Yes.
It's been fascinating looking at the statistics, and absolutely heartbreaking, because there were about 3.6 million people unemployed in 1994. There are 10 million people unemployed today. And the one period in our history of democracy where unemployment really went down was during the years of Thabo Mbeki, especially after 2004, 2005, 2006. and 2007, where economic growth was really taking a leap forward and where unemployment dropped to 23% on the broad definition, which is still a lot, but it is much, much lower than it is now. And it seems to me that we had liftoff in that context. During those years, inequality increased, especially between people who are moving into the middle class and the very poor. But when people are being lifted out of poverty, the Gini coefficient, the measure of inequality, always increases because people don't move out of poverty at the same rate. Some move quicker than others, so the discrepancies between richer and poorer people become greater. But that's often a sign that you're getting liftoff out of poverty. In China, you have this fascinating example of having lifted 800 million people out of poverty, but the measure of inequality, the Gini coefficient, has also grown. So inequality has grown, but there are far fewer very poor people. So I think if you look at the statistics honestly during the Thabo Mbeki years, you will see that we were really making progress on the economic front and on the employment front and on the economic growth front. And then something happened, and the correlation, at least between Jacob Zuma's time in office and the downward spiral of the economy, although correlation may well not be causation, but nevertheless there's a very strong reinforcing factor. How do you come to the conclusion then that the Bell-Pottinger focus on white monopoly capital as an attempt to divide people on the basis of race was an impetus to social justice?
I would say that it was an impetus in terms of reminding us of unfinished business, what Ben Turok refers to as continuities, and I would refer to as the dark shadow of our past. Regarding unemployment, or an improvement during President Mbeki's years, there was an improvement, but it was not sustainable. We were bound to punch. And the increase in poverty started during Mbeki's time. It didn't start during President Zuma's time. It was the economic decline that started after President Zuma. You remember President Zuma comes into office in 2009. Already poverty is increasing, and inequality was already increasing.
And to what extent has that got to do with the population growth statistics, which were also very steep during that time?
I would say very little to do with population growth. If you look at, for example, just the most recent statistics, it would tell you about population growth being 1.something%. It's really an economic approach that is a problem. During apartheid, the state deliberately disabled the majority of its population, deliberately, economically.
But unemployment was much lower then. I'm not in any way justifying anything that apartheid did, but unemployment was much lower.
Well, let me just finish. I would agree with you. Unemployment was much lower because there was even forced employment. You will recall that during the darkest days of apartheid, if you were found anywhere without a job, you were arrested. You had to explain your presence in the urban areas in terms of employment. And there was even a time when leaving your job, there was a law that was passed forcing people to stay in jobs, because if you left your job, I'm just trying to recall the name of the law that forced you to be arrested.
Wasn't it the Urban Areas Act?
No, it's not the Urban Areas Act. It's a criminal law. It's a criminal law. It's a law that if you abandoned your job, you would be arrested. So why was there employment at the time? You will recall that employment figures are about accounting for people who are looking for work. So South Africa had been balkanized into those homelands or Bantustans or pseudo-states that South Africa had created. So when South Africa was counting its unemployment, was looking at mainstream South Africa, everyone who was forced to come to mainstream South Africa had to come as a migrant laborer. And then obviously when you're being counted for unemployment, you're only counted based on have you been looking for a job within a specified period. If you have given up on looking for a job, you're not counted as unemployed.
Well, both are counted. There's the narrow definition, yes, and the broad definition.
But the official statistics would not count you. It's just economists that would say we estimate, because you don't know the ones that are not seeking jobs. We don't have that data. We then estimate and say the ones who haven't been looking for a job in the last few months are this much. That's why right now we say 29% official, probably about
38% unofficial.
38% unofficial. But that one is a guesstimate because we don't have the data. Since the data is only collected from those who have tried to look for jobs.
Well, it's still a horrific figure.
But let me go back to your story about the unemployment, the Mbeki years versus the Zuma years. So I've said the path we took, we have to say, as Greece is saying right now, Greece is doing better than South Africa in terms of moving from its mistakes, is that Greece's approach is saying we can't reclaim the path we're on before the crisis.
Greece,
and you can't attribute it to individuals.
I listened to the Prime Minister being interviewed the other evening. It was fascinating. He said we have to get back to an aggressive growth path by making ourselves very attractive to investors and removing the obstacles to investment and growth.
Yes,
that's what he was saying.
No. The package, I have the report, the full report. They do a full annual report. I agree with you, but the package is bigger than that. It's, but the key to their moving forward is we can't reclaim the path we were on before the crisis.
Well, clearly not.
And I think South Africa has the same challenge, is that the Zuma years were enabled because we're on the wrong pathway. If we think that the way out of where we are right now is to reclaim the pathway we're on under President Mbeki, we are doomed to fail again. Because yes, there was less corruption, yes, there was discipline, but the approach that says you will use 4% of your population to lift 90-something% of your population, it is an irrational approach to economics.
I don't want to
and it was doomed to fail.
I don't want to get too much into the economic debate because we can go into the details of gear, and I would happily do that.
Yes.
And I think a combination of ditching gear, not implementing the National Development Plan, incompetence and corruption were the main reasons for the collapse of the South.
Well, and passing laws that you don't implement. The Equality Act was a law that we all worked for. It was supposed to help us to look at historical disparities in all sectors and then have a progressive way of ending those disparities. That was ditched. And then out of the back of the pocket of Treasury, they came out with the Black Economic Empowerment Act, and they ditched the Equality Act today, 20 years into the Act. Chapter 5 of the Equality Act, which recognized the imbalances of the past and gave us an opportunity to deal with those imbalances in an evolutionary way, has not been implemented. And what then happens? You get fees must fall that says, if you're not going to do it in an evolutionary way, we will force you to do it in a revolutionary way. So I say Belt Pottinger was a gift because it gave us an opportunity to start thinking seriously about social justice. And as I see companies now, I see everyone thinking, we can't just keep leaving others behind. We can't.
No, absolutely, that is true. But we would probably differ on how to become an inclusive society. And I certainly don't see Bell Pottinger as a gift because I was one of their prime targets. Not that I feel sorry for
one of the targets as well, Helen.
We were both.
I'm just saying it's collateral value. I'm not saying it was a good thing the toxicity it introduced is still harming us, but I'm just saying the collateral value from
I understand.
it's just like saying
you
somebody
use a disaster
raped you.
as an opportunity.
Exactly.
You use a disaster.
Yes.
I won't go into that analogy too much because it's got me into
I
a
remember.
lot of trouble
I do
before,
remember.
so I won't. But at least
Yes.
you said it and not me. Now, can I just ask you a little bit, and I'd like to go to the whole social justice issue. You and I would differ quite a bit on, I think, economics, because I think that what we need to get out the way is all the blockages to investment. But I don't want to talk about economics because your field is social justice. And I would like to ask you, how do you understand that term?
Well, social justice, according to the UN and then adapted with my own perspective, is about just and fair distribution of all societal resources, opportunities, privileges and burdens. Ultimately, social justice translates to equal enjoyment of all rights and freedoms, substantively so, not just formal equality. So at the core of social justice is equality. At the core of social justice is also human solidarity. And therefore, that's why at the social justice chair, we focus on both the equality dimension of social justice and the poverty dimension.
Now, that's a very important answer because, as you know, in the United States, there are huge debates around social justice. And at university, there are major contestations around where the focus of institutions should lie. A university like Brown, for example, has decided that its very foundational focus is going to be to achieve social justice. And on the other end of the spectrum, Chicago has said it is going to be a university that traditionally looks to describe and understand reality, and that is the best way to achieve justice in the end. So the notion of the university as a vehicle to search for truth wherever it may lead, which means no safe spaces, which means no deplatforming, which means no ideas are beyond the pale, they can all be debated, which means diversity of concepts, of ideas, of ideologies on the same campus. That is pursued in a Chicago-type context. But Brown believes, on the other hand, that they must vigorously support equality of outcomes by removing the barriers which are primarily ones of oppression from the more privileged groups over the less privileged groups. Do you think that's a fair description of how the debate's unfolding in the United States?
I must indicate that I'm not aware of the Chicago versus Brown University's approach. I'm aware of Harvard's approach, Yale, Georgetown. But what I would be interested in is Stellenbosch. Stellenbosch decided to go on the social justice path before inviting me. Social justice is one of the strategic areas of the new Stellenbosch. Stellenbosch just celebrated its 100th year. And this is a university in a very strange way that has always been about social justice. The only difference is that in the past, Stellenbosch's concern about social justice was always about the concern for the Afrikaners as a group, starting from the Carnegie Commission report around 1929. And sadly, that concern for social justice became justice as just us, and everything else is collateral damage. But under the leadership of the last three vice-chancellors, including Wim de Villiers, who's leading Stellenbosch now.
Chris Brink, I think.
Yes, Chris Brink, Russell Botman, and their approach has been sort of an Ubuntu approach. I am because you are. I can't advantage myself at your expense because somewhere down the line I will disadvantage myself. And their approach also is acknowledging that this university was part of the problem in the past. Some people call it the cradle of apartheid, and they say we have a restitution statement here where the university acknowledges that the past was unjust and that the consequences of the past are still with us, and this university is now going to be one of those agents of change to
so an activist university.
To bring about balance.
Stellenbosch was an activist university before, it wants to be an activist university now.
Yes, but I want to say again is, but Stellenbosch doesn't say that then there will be no truth. They just created something here in artwork that's called the truth, the circle. And in the circle they've brought women. It's a circle of women in conversation, and somehow I made it to that very small circle. And the interesting thing is their approach is there'll be diverse voices, like we did at the summit that you attended. The approach was, we all know that we have to arrive at that destination where truly everyone's potential is freed, where
so when you talk
the
about
imbalances of the
diversity,
past do not trap you in a particular sector of the economy.
Okay, that's absolutely fine,
social structure.
And that's very important. So you talk about diversity at Stellenbosch, not only being race, gender, sexuality, disability, but also of viewpoint, of perspective.
Oh, certainly. I think Stellenbosch allows that, because the only way you're going to arrive at a rational end result is allowing different voices in the conversation in the end.
Well, I'm delighted to hear
where we're
that.
going is already determined by the Constitution. If anybody lives in this country, the starting point is we have a Constitution that says social justice. So we're not even inventing the social justice discourse. The Constitution says we're building a society, a democratic society, founded on, among other things, social justice. So it's a question of, if this society is going to be founded on social justice, how do we make that real? So it's not coming from Stellenbosch or any university. It comes from the Constitution.
I'm delighted to hear this, because the social justice paradigm is very, very different in all the readings that I've done of it. And if I can just explain to you what it is, and then you can explain to me the difference between how you see it.
Yes.
The social justice paradigm in the United States, where much of this debate comes from, and certainly all the academic references come from that I've ever seen, is that some groups are oppressed and marginalized because of the dominance primarily of white males, the historical dominance of white males. And therefore, the equality of outcomes that social justice activists seek to achieve depend on getting rid of whiteness and toxic masculinity as the root causes of all society's inequalities. And that framework becomes the truth. It's not just open to discussion, it becomes a truth which excludes ideas that may be different or that may look at multi-causal effects to marginalization and problems, and who may look at other factors that could give rise to exclusion. All those factors are cast aside as being the result of prejudice, and toxic masculinity, as in all men are trash, or whiteness must fall and whites are the problem, becomes the dominant belief and the dominant dogma. Do you disagree with that?
Well, I disagree with an approach that says whiteness must fall necessarily. However, I want to indicate to you, we had a dialogue at Wits where one young lady stood up and said, yes, our problem is whiteness and whiteness must fall. And I said, no, white supremacy must fall, not whiteness, because whiteness is God-given. One of our colleagues here, though, teaches about whiteness. I think now the term whiteness has two meanings. It has the God-given nature of color, and then it has what you would call white tendencies. So she teaches whiteness. I do personally, I wouldn't use that approach because it's very confusing. And to the ordinary person, when I say to a Gogo Dlamini on the street, whiteness must fall, they might think white people should all go to the sea or some other place. So I don't particularly like that narrative. On all men are trash, I have tweeted to say that's wrong, because not all men are trash. In any group, you can't say the whole group is poisoned. But on toxic masculinity, yes. The world is distorted because of devaluing of certain people, and we have to be honest about that patriarchy has been at the core of devaluing. Racism, which puts whiteness at the top and blackness at the bottom, has been at the top of devaluing. Disability discrimination, heterosexualism, nationalism, all of this. My understanding of social justice is as defined in UN documents. It's not confined to race issues. It's really about embracing the humanity of every person. If you were to say to me, what is social justice in a nutshell? It's about embracing the humanity of every human being and making sure that no human being is excluded from opportunity or confined to disadvantage because of their color, their gender, their nationality, their sexual orientation, and all of these other human attributes.
Well, I'm 100% with you on all of that, because you're saying, and I agree with you, that the role of a social justice intervention, whether it's an activist or whether it's a professor, is to challenge unequal treatment of people in the environment.
I think it's more than that, and I think that's where the Equality Act was messed up, because what they did now in government is that they left the Equality Act in terms of the part of it that challenges unequal treatment. You see, an anti-discrimination paradigm works if we start on the same footing and occasionally we're going to discriminate against each other. When discrimination is an aberration, you need an anti-discrimination paradigm. But when you have the story that I've spoken to you about, where you have a monopoly board where others have been given an advantage to start and they're given money and they're dominant on the board and the others are on the fringes, you then say equality means we'll treat you the same.
But then you don't...
We'll only have an anti-discrimination paradigm. The unequal ones are going to get worse, actually. Instead of staying on the fringes, they're going to fall off the board, which is what has happened in South Africa with inequality growing and poverty growing.
But if you want to look at disadvantage, you don't need a proxy in race or gender, because disadvantage can be measured and it is there, and we don't need to start entrenching race or gender as the markers of disadvantage. Now, this is where my problem comes in. When people start saying any disparity in outcomes is proof of injustice. There have been some very interesting experiments recently around this particular thing. But where I think the social justice paradigm and dogma and ideology, if you will, becomes quite dangerous is that it tends to valorize victimhood. It puts victimhood as equal to virtue. And so the more multiply one is victimized by gender, by race, by disability, by sexuality, the more virtuous one is seen to be, and the more worthy of protection of society and the evil of the rest of society. And valorizing victimhood tends to create a whole perverse sense of incentives and often distracts attention from doing the real things that will empower marginalized individuals and marginalized groups.
May I respond?
Yes, certainly.
I would say you are right that victimhood should not be valorized. But I think in South Africa we suffer from two pathologies. One is to valorize victimhood. The other one is to pretend victimhood doesn't exist. There are people, for example, in this country that thought that with the new constitution, we were now equal, and everyone should now run as fast as possible. The fact that some were given, the blues were given an advantage and the pinks are starting late, no, magically, the pinks, if they run fast enough, in business, if you run fast enough, in schools, if you, despite the disparities in terms of infrastructure, people would say with the land question, it doesn't matter, land is not an important asset, which is nonsensical given the fact that in South Africa, land is collateral that is sought by banks. They would give you comparisons with countries where there isn't much land and therefore nobody else has an advantage because of land. So in a country where, for example, courts give you an advantage to enter into a restaurant, you can't say to me, oh, coats are not important in another country. But if here I need a coat to enter into a restaurant and all of the coats have been given to one group, you have to say to me, there has to be a way of rationalizing the coats if there's no way of making new coats. So there are things, for example, like land, which has to be redistributed because there's only this land. But there's then the issue that you're talking about the economy, about do we redistribute poverty, as Ben Turok says, or do we create wealth and distribute it? I would say, for me, actually, the UN, the World Bank, and the IMF have done studies that show that if you exclude women from opportunities, you stunt your own growth because of structural inequality. And then I say, if that's true, we can use the same wisdom and say, if you exclude your disabled people, if you exclude your black people.
Completely, but then it isn't on race, it's on ensuring that you get the obstacles to then being able to advance as much as their ability enables them.
It's race whether we like it or not.
Let me just challenge you on this question.
In South Africa, I just want to go back to race and say, if two people are poor, one is black and one is white, poverty determinants are not just money. Poverty determinants are the social networks.
I agree.
And one of my colleagues, Marna, talks about it very, very, very concretely because she has seen it in her life. But if you're poor but your network is affluent, then your poverty is absorbed by your network. So in South Africa, because of the racial disparities, poverty among black people can only get worse. That's why we're talking about 64.2% versus 1%.
All right, now
it's not individualized. It is
collectivized.
It works exponentially, and also it works like an epidemic. It feeds on this. It's a systemic problem, not an individualized problem.
All right. I'm going to take a practical example and ask you to apply your analysis there. Many of the people in government who've approached this problem have believed that creating a bureaucratic bourgeoisie will help solve that problem. So now let's look at Eskom, completely transformed. I remember when Paul Letlaphe was the Human Resources Director of Eskom, and she gave this famous interview to the Financial Mail in which she said her job is to employ 2 people every day, one of whom has to be a black woman, so that she can achieve her targets and help social justice and restitution. And it completely deflected the goal that is Eskom's core objective, which is to generate and transmit electricity. Now, Eskom was a socio-political experiment in social justice as set out by Paul Letlaphe. Eventually, they couldn't actually implement their main mandate at all, and the capacity to generate and transmit electricity collapsed. And the people who suffered most under that were the poor and the people who lost their jobs as a result. So how do you disentangle that experiment in achieving social justice via Eskom from the kind of approach that might be better? And who are the people who are exacerbating social injustice under an experiment like Eskom?
Well, firstly, if what you're saying is true, it was wrong, but I suspect it's a little bit more complex than that. that I don't think Eskom fell because of an experiment in inclusiveness. I think if Eskom at any given stage forgot its core mandate, then that would be the failure. I remember engaging with the minister about water, and she saying it was right to re-advertise a tender because the BEE requirements were going to fail in the first tender, and engaging here about what was the job of this particular agency. If it's water, you have to make sure that the core business overrides any other considerations. So I don't know with Eskom, but having listened to Edward Kizwita, I don't think at any stage during the time of those early pioneers in an inclusive group at Eskom deviated from the mandate. I do think when you employ people for reasons other than ability, you're going to fail. You're going to fail not just at Eskom, you're going to fail in all spheres of life. And Thuli Madonsela and I wrote an article about this, about affirmative action. But affirmative action should be affirming excellence, even when it's packaged in ways that are not usual to the person who is managing, and it's about affirming diversity. If, of course, you go for chronism and you pretend it's affirmative action, you go for window dressing and all of these other things that are done in the name of affirmative action, then your business is going to fall.
Correct, and I completely agree with you on that one. Now, I just want to come onto the land issue because there's some new statistics on land. We're still waiting for the government's audit, but the most recent audit that's been there shows that there is far more land in black hands than most people have ever thought. If you look, for example, at the land that has always been in black hands and those that is restituted and compensated, it is 60% in KwaZulu-Natal, 39% in the Eastern Cape, 37% in Limpopo. And when you add urban land and state land, it becomes 72% in KwaZulu-Natal and 66% in Limpopo and 63% in Gauteng. So it's an enormous amount. And the other fascinating thing about this audit that I read was that the market mechanism has been far more successful and transferred double the amount of land to historically disadvantaged individuals than the state mechanism. So it is quite wrong to say that the market mechanism has failed. It's actual state inefficiency that has failed. And that has come through more and more in the analysis that has been put down. So I think what people are ignoring is the enormous amount of the most fertile land in South Africa, of the by far the most fertile land in South Africa, that is in black hands, but it's the ownership patterns and the whole metaphor around the tragedy of the commons. I mean, if you look at the Nkandla Trust, it's the size of Hungary, a whole country. And can we say that the Nkandla Trust is producing food or jobs or helping people achieve social justice? These are big questions when you're wanting to deal with a land issue.
Well, Helen, I don't know where you get your statistics. I would say it's a big country. And I haven't started to hear the story about fertile and infertile land today. It's a historical case.
Yes.
Fertile land was in white South Africa and in white hands.
No.
That was a historical... No, but can I take the floor?
Yeah.
That was a historical decision. That's why Bophuthatswana, Transkei, and all of these homelands have weird shapes, because where there was fertile land, where there was water, it was scooped out and kept in main South Africa. So I don't know where you get that statistics, but maybe Nkandla Trust might be the only place where there is some fertile land, because in KZN, they didn't scoop a lot out because there was a kingdom already. So maybe there may be aspects of it that belongs to the kingdom. But in the rest of South Africa, it's very clear that the fertile land was scooped out and the water sources were scooped out into main South Africa, and that was in white hands. But look around where we are right here in Stellenbosch and tell me the land here that used to be owned by the colored community, even the very first white farmer to produce wine was colored, and ask how many colours have land. But the worst part in places like this is that government, and you're right, that state inefficiency is part of the problem, because here in Stellenbosch, land was given to farmers right on the eve of democracy. One of the farmers, a nice fellow that I'm not going to mention by name, was going to come and speak at the land summit that we held to talk about the land he holds right now, that on the eve of democracy, people were given 99-year leases. White farmers were given 99-year leases. People have farms as we speak right now that they pay the state about 38,000 rand a month. So yes, it has been state inefficiency, but the bulk of the land was in white hands. My view is on the land question, Agri-SA is more pragmatic about it. They're not giving us a denialist approach. They're just saying, forget about grabbing, because we have to live together and we have to till this land in a manner that is a win-win. And they're encouraging an approach that says, if farmers are prepared, which they are prepared, I met them in Uppington, to share on their own, and the state then can facilitate that process, that should be done.
Absolutely. And it's being done very nicely in parts of the Western Cape too.
And even here in Stellenbosch, there are farmers that have done it. So my view on the land thing is that land has to be redistributed, and we have to stop playing games about that thing. It is part of the toxic debate in this country, and if we keep trying to deflect it, it is going to bite us.
The last thing I want to do is deflect or duck a debate.
Yes.
And the very last thing I want to do is ever justify anything that had anything to do with apartheid. But I think if you look at an analysis of the fertility of land, you will find that it is a little different from what you've put out there. But it is not critical to our discussion here. The least fertile land is the Northern Cape, and of course that's all in white hands just about. But let's not go into...
But those good people are prepared to engage meaningfully about redistribution.
They are. But the critical thing is to use our fertile land to produce food and jobs. That would be real land reform.
But can I tell you something, Helen, that I didn't know? Young people taught me. You know, I was at a conference on August 9 this year, and I said, oh, this whole thing about everyone is going to get rich through land at the time when we have in the 4th Industrial Revolution and the 5th one is knocking at the door, it's nonsensical.
It is nonsensical.
No, that's what I said. Who needs land? And everyone put up their hand. And I said, what are you going to do with it? They said something that should have been obvious to me. It's not true that everyone who has land tills it. Some till it, some rent it out. So if you redistribute land, it's an asset. And the asset structure of South Africa right now is such that it's, I think that the statistics says that about 90% of the country's assets are in the hands of 7% of the population. And that for me should be obvious to everyone that that's a recipe for disaster. That's why we have UN Sustainable Development Goals, because wise people from all over the world realize that the reason we have extremism in this world, or at least that extremism is attractive to people, is because of those gross disparities.
That's absolutely true, and I completely agree with that. But there's an entire literature on the capital income ratio, and in South Africa it isn't very high because we are not a very rich country, and because there are very few very, very rich people. That's the irony given our numbers. So that's an entire debate that is absolutely critical to have, but it's perhaps too mathematically complex
South Africa is
for an audience.
South Africa is the second richest country on this continent, and it's one of the richest countries in the world. In fact, Africa as a continent...
When you talk about value added, I'm talking about is in terms of riches. Value added.
Well, in terms of its assets, unless you're talking about richness in terms of GDP, but
talking about GDP capital to income ratio. Yeah. But let's not go into that because it's too complex for an audience who wants to have a look at it.
Income, you're looking at it in terms of GDP and things like that. My sense of it is that South Africa is a rich country, but part of the reason it's not living to its potential is that it's not using all its horses.
Yeah, absolutely.
And social justice is about making sure that we invest in all of our human an environmental capital to make sure that everyone is productive, because people can't be productive if they're not fully educated. People can't be productive if they're not integrated in the markets. We have
I'm
brilliant
100% with you on that, and that's a function of bad education, not necessarily race, etc., etc.
It's a system, Helen. There's education. There's this narrative that says, oh, if you educate people, everything is going to be fine. There's numerous unemployed graduates. It's a whole systemic problem. There are multiple young people that are brilliant, that have started businesses, but they don't have markets, they don't have capital. The whole M plan is named after Palisa Musa. Palisa Musa is a good example of somebody who works hard, but she has no access to capital. She has no access to markets. She has no access to...
The state's supposed to have all of these institutions that don't function to help people. That's the role of the state, to give people a leg up, and none of these institutions are working.
Well, in a functional society, it's not the role of the state only. Stellenbosch is launching an initiative in a couple of weeks' time that is called the Stellenbosch Network. Because how Stellenbosch was built on its own was that it wasn't the function of the state, is that those who have lift others, those who have a control of the market, they open the market to others, and they're doing it now. There's also another project that I've forgotten what is it called, it's some corridor. But I just think, for me, the business community, some business people like Bill Gates, etc., realize that capitalism that is based on greed, that a capitalism that is supremely extractive is destructive to itself, is destructive to democracy and to peace in the world. We need to think of something that is a middle ground between capitalism and socialism. But from socialism, we don't take the state architecture of socialism. We'll look at the communal part of some aspects of socialism.
Good. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. I don't want it to carry on too long, but I had two final questions that I wanted to ask you. One related to #fallism, and the other related to the EFF. And I want to read you the little birthday wish that you sent out to the EFF on Twitter. You said, "Happy birthday, EFF. Thank you for playing your part in deepening and strengthening constitutional democracy while highlighting social justice imperatives." Now, I must say, when I read that, I kind of choked a bit, because I thought to myself, here's an organization living high on the hog, on stolen money or the proceeds of crime, living totally unsustainable lives, but preaching to anyone who wants to listen to them that they stand up for the poor. Meanwhile, they are just as bad looters as anything they might oppose in Jacob Zuma. So how about that message?
Well, the EFF might say the same about your party.
I don't think they'd have grounds.
Stolen goods have been funding the party, but I don't want to go into that debate. At the time when I congratulated the EFF, I understood that they are flawed in some respects, but they have played their part in raising issues in Parliament that nobody was raising, or at least in furthering conversations we've started. Let's think about fees must fall, for example. When I reported on fees must fall in Parliament, it was 2013 already, when at one of the universities, children were sleeping in toilets. And I started my story with something that I thought was an icebreaker that would touch everyone's heart. A child who had been kicked out of one of the university, a different university, and I had to rescue him and as a perpetrator asked the university to take him back, and then as a person try to find somebody who can fund him. And Parliament said to me that was irrelevant. So that's before EFF's time. And then EFF comes into Parliament, despite their flaws, because these young people know what it is to go for days without food. They know what it is to be at a university but sleep in a bathroom. They have been consistent in raising those issues. So no accountabilities. We started this conversation about the Nkandla matter that ended up in the Crown Court. The EFF was the first to sue on the powers of the power protector, and of course, and I'm grateful that the DA joined and we also joined. So they've played their part in strengthening democracy. But some of the things that you've raised about them are some of the concerns that people have. And I don't want to go into there about whether it's true or it's not true. It is that if parties are truly to anchor democracy, they have to ask, if I'm getting this money at this end of the tunnel, has Gogo Dlamini had to suffer for me to get this money? If Gogo Dlamini has had to suffer for me to get this money, is it proper? Because otherwise we get a culture that says we're eating for you, which is something I said in 2010 when I was attacked for against the rules. I said, we're not the mafia where you're going to say we don't touch family, and when people are going to be like Animal Farm to say, okay, we are the pigs, we liberated you and we running your government, therefore when we eat, we're doing it for you. We don't want that.
Well, I think your metaphor on Gogo Dlamini fits the VBS situation to a T, if I may say.
But they would say Steinhoff. They would say with the DA, there's the Steinhoff issue that...
Look, with respect, it's not comparable. I mean, no one runs around with credit cards of Steinhoff paying Gucci and what's it, Louis Vuitton. I don't even know how to pronounce these names.
No, I think why our democracy has fallen is because of that question of making things an issue of degrees. For me, our Constitution entrenches an ethical state, Section 195, Section 96, and the preamble itself is really about breaking away from the past. I think all of us have to reflect and say, what kind of improprieties have we allowed to creep in? And we were only worried about degree. And looking back, how do we change things? Because that's all that has happened in corporate South Africa. When this thing, blew into the face of KPMG, I remember saying, chances are other firms have done similar things. And it turned out that was true. So for me, again, this is a gift. And I'm not saying I'm exonerating the EFF. I'm just saying that going forward, as we elect people into parliament, we have to decide what kind of humans do we want who are going to be caretakers of our democracy. And if they've not shown empathy and compassion for the poor in the way they use the money of the poor, or in the way they react when the money of the poor has been stolen, will they show compassion on the other side, or will they have an opportunity to take more from the poor?
I'm with you on all of that. I mean, ethical people in government is the basis of accountable, capable governance. There's no question about that, and I'm with you on that 100%. Lastly, this question about fallism. You played a critical role, and I think everybody in South Africa that I know was fully behind the fees must fall focus. And then, of course, the goalposts moved a whole lot, and then hundreds of millions of rands of damage was done to university infrastructure and things like that as the protest shifts and as the goalposts kept moving. But you raised about 660,000 rand with the help of some other people, and then you got worried as to how it was being spent, and you were looking for a social justice organization to come and supervise it. Are you happy now that the money's being spent properly and where it's supposed to be?
Yes, it had never been spent, actually. We raised the money as Pub Protector, but we didn't want to collect it, because as Pub Protector it wasn't our job to collect money. And then we kept looking for an organization until we got SAICA. Unfortunately, by the time we got SAICA, and not everyone who had pledged some money gave us the money. I think the main donor was Anglo Ashanti, and it was a marvelous opportunity. The money went into various young people at universities, and my own university at the beginning of this year, we had trouble with some of the students being not registered, because this university raises a whole lot of money to get rid of historical debt, but there were just a few leftovers, and we had to ask for some of that money, 114,000 that was left to come in. And as I speak, I'm so glad you raised this matter, Helen. As we speak, there'll be more historical debt again, because the historical debt was covering 2018 as they start in 2019, and we'll be climbing Drakensberg mountain before the end of the year, asking executives to join us at the cost of 10,000 to raise this money. But personally, I was telling Diane, my PA, or my colleague now who's project manager, that personally I feel my generation dropped the ball. I don't know a single black person my age who went to university hungry or without money or had their own parents pay for their money. We went there on scholarships from strangers from overseas and local churches. I think we dropped the ball in terms of either raising funds and having a trust, a civil society trust that makes sure that we level the playing field at school, or make sure that government pays whatever was going to work. Yesterday, again, I got another student. Good God, it's the end of September. A student is writing to me and saying that she is owing 19,000 at her university. And she sends me all information on the email, which I'm now, a colleague has advised me where to send it. She shows that her father died. She sends the death certificate. She sends her results, her registration, her mother's situation, who's on a disability grant. And I'm saying, why do we have a society where people who can be at university are falling through the cracks purely because of poverty? It's improper. None of the poorer African countries have done that. We're the only African country that has failed to level the playing field when it comes to education. And the poverty statistics and also the speech given by Padile Hotla at the Social Justice Summit shows that education is a major determinant of poverty.
I agree with that.
And in higher education, although there are unemployed graduates, but you're less likely to be unemployed when you have a university qualification.
Much less, much less. Prof, let's drink our last sip of tea to removing the barriers to opportunity and to building an inclusive society through greater opportunity and removing those barriers. Thank you very much for speaking to me today, and more strength to your arm.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been a privilege. Thank you.